So yeah, I'm British Vietnamese-Chinese, and the Vietnamese side comes from my mum and my dad. So I'm more Vietnamese, and I was born in Britain, and my mum's half Chinese, so that's where my Chinese heritage comes from. Thank you, it's a great question. I feel that I've been producing sort of in film, theatre, immersive film and installations for about 15 years now. And my career started at the National Theatre in an immersive storytelling studio. And I was very fortunate to work there because I managed to develop loads of skills. But what I noticed that there was this massive gap in supporting East Asian and Southeast Asian artists. So after 4 years at the National, I really wanted to focus my work in, I guess, that community and look at how I can use my producer skills to really platform EC voices. When I say EC, it's East and Southeast Asian voices. So yes, my focus is to look at those communities, people of those heritage, to really look at how I could fundraise and bring those stories forward, because there's still a massive gap in the British arts and media in those representational sort of stories. And I do have a leaning sort of focus towards Vietnamese, because even though we've been here for about 50 years now, there's still a massive gap in how our stories are told through our lens, and how that's in the sort of British discourse in the arts industry. So Star Nha Ease is the name of a Vietnamese festival that looks at cinema and wider arts. And it was the idea was conceived in 2019 when I did my master's. And it was me looking at how Vietnamese stories were very absent in British cinemas, because there was the Hollywood canon, so you get the American sort of lens of Vietnam through that angle. And I thought, where are the Vietnamese stories? So I took myself to Vietnam, visited the archive, and discovered there is like this massive, extensive archive of Vietnamese reels on the wall through the Vietnamese lens. So from that, I've based my whole thesis on how I could bring films from Vietnam to the UK. And jump to 2024, I was approached by Live Cinema UK, who were my co-producers for the pilot year of Star Nha Ease. And we co-produced the pilot season with the BFI backing. And what we wanted to do is introduce Vietnamese cinema to the British cinema audiences. So in that process, we needed to find a name. And myself, another curator who's British Vietnamese, and a director who directed one of the feature films in our opening season, started to look at what was in the conversation in the diaspora, because we really wanted to, focus on the diaspora Vietnamese community. So we sort of can I say brainstormed, was it mind mapped ideas of what words really connected to British Vietnamese. And so we just sat and just looked at loads of names, and what stood out was the herb, the Star Anise, which is something that's very frequently used in Vietnamese cuisine. And I loved the words, so I said to Kung, who was the co-curator, like, how can we use this in a title? How could we code switch into English and to Vietnamese? So we broke the sounds up, and then we started to think about the British Vietnamese journey into, our parents and our second generation and third generation. So we really wanted to focus a meaningful title for the festival. So Star is a guiding light for people going to travel to go and find a home, which brings us to the second part of the word, is Nha. Nha means home in Vietnamese. My pronunciation may not be perfect because my Vietnamese is shocking. So it's finding the home, and then ease is the emotional state of actually settling. So that's kind of the title of the film festival. So that question has many answers. So initially, again, when I just want to draw back from what I've said, that, the Vietnamese community in Britain really haven't had their stories told in the British media and culture. So Star Nha Ease is an initiative to welcome Vietnamese people into art spaces so they can see themselves represented on screen. So it's very much the core focus is to get the Vietnamese community to be, I guess, engaging with art spaces in Britain all over. But it's also for us to engage with cinephiles and anyone who lives in Britain to widen their perception of Vietnamese narratives and stories and characters. In addition to that, when we started, the Vietnamese history is so complex. So, I think anyone who knows a little bit about Vietnam, it's not an easy history to understand or to represent. So what I try to do with this second season is to really look at the conversation between Vietnam and Britain and the British Vietnamese. So I expanded the season or the festival into training Vietnamese curators in understanding how narratives from their home country can come to international waters, and they had a hand in creating, the story that's brought to the UK. Then I worked with British Vietnamese curators who are aspiring to work on a level of an international film festival, and they helped shape the programme. And so it was kind of like a massive team of people to further look at how Vietnamese stories could be shown in cinemas in the UK. That's such a loaded question. I feel like, do we have all day? This is an identity question, and I think it's best to first state that I'm second generation. So my journey in my identity is complex, as I believe in many others like me. And I think it's difficult to, pinpoint everyone's sort of like in general, like what does being British Vietnamese mean? How do you straddle those two cultures? I think a lot of it is rooted in the way I was brought up. And I think, living in a very Eastern household and then being injected into a very Western environment, school, friends, you're constantly questioning where you belong and what belongs to you. And I think it didn't really surface properly until I started working in the arts. And I think the arts has such a beautiful thing where you can create different platforms to present the stories that you want to tell. So I feel like it's really important to me, especially in the last 5 years, because it's helped me shape projects and my circle of friends and community and how I live my day-to-day life. And I think about it all the time because I feel, like I said, it's still so very misunderstood in the arts. And I think, after 50 years is about time that we start reimagining and reinventing and reframing how we tell our stories. And I think that's important in the projects that we choose to produce, which is I'm a producer, or write and perform in. Yeah, again, it's quite a complex question, and I feel like I may not look it, but I am a lot older. So I think in the decades that I've existed in Britain, how people receive me and how I've been treated has fluctuated. So in my early years, of course, being brought up in East London, I did get a few racial slurs thrown at me. I was the only sort of Vietnamese-Chinese kid in the school bar my siblings, and that was East London, which is quite unusual. I think growing up, finding different platforms to share a community and feeling like you belong to something or someone or a group has been quite rewarding, but it's still very hard because even though you have the reward of like acceptance in a community, you're creating work, there's this amazing conversation I had with Vietnamese people when I was there, is that you're constantly having to justify who you are, where you're from. And in Britain, you're not British enough, you're not Vietnamese enough to other Vietnamese. When you're in Vietnam, you feel very Vietnamese, but to the Vietnamese people, you're not very Vietnamese. So it's this constant battle of having to justify who you are, how you identify, and how that impacts everything that you do. So yeah. Really interesting question about why British Vietnamese or Vietnamese people in Britain are still very unseen and unheard. And I think you've got to take it back to when they actually first arrived here, and it was under Thatcher's rule. And what happened there was that, to eliminate any kind of gang culture, it was this policy of disbursement. So when the Vietnamese came, they came in big numbers. So a lot of Vietnamese people were spread all over the UK. Now you think about that as an action with a group of people who have left a country, one because war, two because of ethnic cleansing, and them coming from whatever their journey was, is always complex. And coming to a country where you kind of are in different places, it's very hard to build community. And when you look at the word community, it takes years and years to build the trust and coming together. So I think, you think of 50 years as a large number, but 50 years for a group of people to start coming together and trusting each other and building little pockets where they can actually be. So I think that had the very beginning of them arriving has impacted the way they've been hidden. And I think if I were to relate it to the arts, is that, I feel we're quite far behind on the basis that disbursement, building trust, and also our grandparents' journey has been so complex that it's so hard for them to talk about. And mental health and mental well-being is not really well recognized in that generation. So I think even just talking about how you operate in your everyday life is not a thing. You kind of just survive and you get on with it. So very much like the nation itself, Vietnamese people, their main focus is survival. And it's literally, that's the root. So at what point do you break out, build a community, survive, and then find a space to create and develop the stories where you're not very well represented or heard? So after 50 years, I feel like there are tiny little things that are happening, especially in my world, where we feel safe enough to create those spaces, but it's taken time, and there's a really big reason because of the history of the migration over to the UK. So yeah. I mean, of course, I think it's absolutely brilliant that the Vietnamese community and a charity like VFP, Vietnamese Family Partnership, have concocted, I think, a project that's lasted over 2 years now, in engaging with the community and asking them what they want to represent them in a permanent way in a country that they've resided in for so long. So the Vietnamese sculpture that has been developed is very much the heart of what the community wants. And I think it's so important to really, understand that it's not just an artistic project where, the Vietnamese diaspora, second generation, are thought of. It's a project that's really rooted in understanding all the generations and putting it into one place. And I think it's about time that we have something physical and permanent in a public space where a community of people who have existed for so long in a city and a country that they can feel proud of. And, it's not just for them, it's for others to really understand it and their sort of history, because the sculpture very much encapsulates so many different elements of what being Vietnamese means in Britain. Beyond the permanent physical sculpture, what we've kind of developed is something, like I said, like the Vietnamese history is so complex, is that you cannot simply put it into one structure and think everyone will know what it is or understand the history of it. So we've developed a digital archive that's very much connected to the sculpture. So when it gets built, when people visit it, they'll be able to scan a QR code of some kind that's embedded onto the sculpture that leads them into an archive that will have a multitude of stories from different generations. And it's not something that you create and it's done. It's going to be an ongoing archive where each year we'll be fundraising to commission at least 5 groups of people. It could be 2 big community groups and 3 Vietnamese artists to generate stories that represent their personal journey or a community, and that gets put into the archive for people to experience every year.